Ugly, a memoir by Robert Hogue. Chapter 11. Friends and Enemies. The operations the doctors had done on my face over the years started to pay off. I made new friends at school and at home. Some kids were quick to see how different I was, but many others seemed not to notice, or at least not to care. I wasn't the most popular kid in school. I didn't have people rushing to spend every possible second with me at lunch, but I wasn't totally shunned and ignored either. David and I were still friends, but I made a bunch of new ones too. Chief among my new school friends were Robert Furman and Robert Webb. For a while we became the three Roberts, referred to as Robert H., Robert F., and Robert W. I had an easy connection with Robert F. Before a growth spurt, he had been an average height and a bit awkward. We both loved books and stories about stars and distant planets and spaceships. At Guardian Angels, we'd started hanging out talking about space and astronomy. Robert W. was fun to hang around with too, but I think the main reason I wanted to be friends with him was because his name was Robert. After all, it wouldn't have been the three Roberts if it were only the two of us. There were friends at home as well. Manly West was still a young suburb when I was growing up, especially compared to nearby Wynnum. There were a few kids my age living right near our house. They were all girls, but that didn't matter to me. There was Cassandra, who lived next door, and down the road were Belinda and Evelyn. Evelyn's family didn't have a lot of money, and sometimes Mom would send us down to her house with tins of food. Often it was canned beets, which suited me just fine, as I thought they were horrid and we always had so much of them. To me, Cassandra was the most important. The others would come and go, but Cassandra and I were constants. She was the only child of a couple living next door, so she was always happy to get out of the house and play. She was even happier to come and join in the loud chaos of a large family like ours. Cassandra and I would spend whole afternoons chasing each other around one backyard, then over the fence into the other. We'd bounce on her trampoline for hours on end. She would run up and down the sidewalk, and I'd go up and down the road on a skateboard, artificial legs off, propelling myself forward with my arms. We'd play Legos. She always had more Legos than me, but that was okay because I had a much higher proportion of space Legos, and if there was one thing you needed to build spaceships, it was space Legos. We'd grab the old transistor radio her parents had given her, go outside at night, raise the antenna and point it at the stars. Right at the bottom of the AM dial, just when you almost couldn't turn it any further, we'd pick up strange signals, rhythmic electric pulses that could only be one thing: UFOs. Cassandra would sometimes turn up at our back door and politely ask Mom or Dad if I was home and would like to play. For my part, I'd go down to the fence between our two houses and yell, "Cassandra!" as loud as I could, a human megaphone. Because Dad was a shift worker and would often start work early the next day, we'd have dinner at 5:30 or 6 p.m. and listen to the news. From 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. was TV viewing time for Mom and Dad. Without fail, the television would be switched to some news or current affairs program. Much to my horror, this meant missing shows like The Goodies and especially Doctor Who. I'd go over to Cassandra's house right after dinner so I could watch Doctor Who. We'd listen, sometimes scared, for any familiar but strange alien signals. When the show finished, I'd head home so I could have a shower and get ready for bed. She was my best friend for a long time, even when I became a typical boy and was afraid to admit it. Together, Cassandra, Evelyn, Belinda, and I had plenty of adventures. A few years in a row, we sold grapefruit on the corner. They were picked from a tree in Cassandra's yard. We made signs and moved a table onto the sidewalk. Given all our efforts, tree climbing, grapefruit picking, sign design, and drawing, we priced the grapefruit at 50 cents each. I decided the best form of advertisement was to go stand on the corner of our street and yell at the top of my voice, "Grapefruits for sale!" I think in the first year we sold a grand total of 1 grapefruit. Next grapefruit season, we were right back at it, though, picking, making signs, and selling. Again, my chief duty was to stand on the corner and yell at the top of my voice, "Grapefruits! Grapefruits for sale! Get your grapefruits!" The first day we had no luck, selling a total of 0 grapefruits. We went home dejected. Next morning we assembled to give it another go. It didn't look like we were going to make our fortunes in grapefruit sales that year either. Then someone walked up and asked how many grapefruits we had. Cassandra said we had about a dozen in various stages of ripeness. The customer asked if she could buy all of them for $10. Absolutely, we said, after conferring with each other for exactly 3 seconds. A whole $10? That was a fortune to us. The neighbor handed over the money and we handed over the grapefruits, happier and richer than we had ever been in our little lives. Things changed when we told Cassandra's parents. We were excited and asked if they could take the $10 and split it 4 ways for us. Concerned that the neighbor had spent so much on our enterprise, they decided we should go and give half of it back. Suddenly our fortune was only half a fortune, but give it back we did. I think they must have thought the poor lady had only bought all the grapefruits to shut me up. The 3 girls were a little younger than me, and they seemed to adjust to me pretty quickly. Young kids are naturally very accepting of new and different things. The kid with the squishy nose and strange legs isn't that surprising when you're 3 years old and you hear stories about talking bears sitting at the table eating porridge. It's only as kids get older that they start to know what's normal and what's not. We used to congregate on sidewalks, in backyards, and at nearby park to play on the swings and scheme and scamper along the local creek, building bridges and trying to catch small fish in the little stream. The girls would do cartwheels and I'd practice handstands without my prosthetics on. One day when I took my legs off, Evelyn pointed at them. "Oh, what happened to your feet?" "Nothing," I said. "Who chopped them off?" Evelyn asked. "No one," I said. "Did you chop them off?" Still with the questions. "No." "Did the doctors chop them off?" "No." "Were you born like that?" "Yes." And we kept on playing. Other questions weren't always quite so easy to answer. Sometimes I'd get asked, "How did you lose your legs?" As if I'd left them on the bus and they were waiting to be reclaimed from the lost and found. Outright sympathy could be just as frustrating. Sometimes passers-by would tilt their heads and deliver an undeserved smile. "Look at that kid limping along the sidewalk," the smile would say. "Isn't he wonderful, inspirational, amazing?" There were some things I just couldn't avoid when it came to my disability. The first was knowing I'd need to work smart during my life because I wasn't going to be able to work hard physically. When I came home from school with a bad test score, Mom would look at me sternly and Dad would say what he always said. At various times, Dad had been a meat worker, a cane cutter, a forklift driver, and a lawnmower man. He knew I had a different path. "Robert," Dad would say, "you're not going to be digging ditches for a living. You've got to try harder." The second was that I seemed to have more of a sense than most kids about the physical space surrounding me. The way I experienced the physical world was always changing. If you have 2 artificial legs, sometimes you're short and sometimes you're tall. Sometimes you experience the world on all 4s, jumping from place to place. Other times you have your legs on and operate the way the world intended, except when you stumble or your legs start aching 15 minutes after you've put them on. The third thing was that there weren't a lot of people like me I could look up to. Men are meant to be strong. We are supposed to be powerful. Dad and Michael and Gary were tall and broad-shouldered. Most of the men I saw on TV were built well and active too. There were no disabled role models for a young boy trying to work out what sort of man he should become. Those issues didn't have simple answers. I'd have to work out how to make my own way in the world. Chapter 12, We All Fall Down. It was July 1979, and the American Space Agency, NASA, had a problem. The first space station it had launched was about to fall to Earth. Skylab, a 77-ton, 26-meter-long chunk of metal, had orbited Earth for 6 years. Scientists on board had successfully conducted hundreds of experiments and undertaken thousands of observations. About 170 photographs of the Sun and the Earth were taken. Astronauts did 42 hours of spacewalks. But by the mid-1970s, Skylab was in trouble. If its orbit wasn't corrected, it was going to crash to Earth. For a while, NASA had planned to use the new space shuttles it was building to repair Skylab and boost its orbit, but a delay meant they weren't ready in time. Skylab was on its own, and it was falling down. There was a tremendous media interest about Skylab falling to Earth, certainly enough to capture the attention of a boy who was about to turn 7 and had already started dreaming about the stars. It was expected to crash somewhere in the southern hemisphere. Surely that meant there was every chance it could crash into Australia, I thought. NASA couldn't be sure, but I was. It was going to hit us. Luckily, David and I had a plan. The parts of Skylab that fell to Earth would conveniently fall on the bathroom block at Guardian Angels. The entire school would conveniently be inside the bathroom block at this time. I'm guessing at this stage that it was the boys' bathroom, but we conveniently skipped over some of those details. Anyway, Skylab would crash into the school, we'd all be in the bathroom, and the crash would conveniently collapse the entrance and we would be trapped. If everything went to plan, it would be a convenient convenience. With everyone at school trapped inside, there would be no one to rescue us, and we'd need to find our own way out. David and I worked out that I would give him one of my artificial legs, which he would use as a battering ram. He could then smash the debris and rubble out of the way and free us all. We were so prepared, we even had detailed engineering diagrams in crayon of what the rescue would look like. But that wasn't the way things went down. Instead of landing on Brisbane, Skylab broke up, with some parts falling into the Indian Ocean off Western Australia. Other major parts rained down hundreds of miles east of Perth. Almost 2,500 miles away in Brisbane, my chance to be a school hero had crashed and burned as well. Flaming chunks of metal crashing from the sky weren't the only things falling down in the late 1970s. Like most schools, Guardian Angels had an annual field day. The fact that I had no legs did not excuse me from participating. Apparently, if God did not want me to race, he would not have given me artificial legs. For sports day, we all trekked to Iona, where Michael and Gary both went, and where I would presumably end up too. Iona had several sports fields of its own, more than enough room for the few hundred students from our small elementary school. There were events like tunnel ball and tug of war, but the real highlight was the sprints. I entered in the 100-meter sprint along with all the other kids. It was a compulsory as a soggy tomato sandwiches at snack time. Catherine was still at Guardian Angels, so she came along to race as well, and Mom and Dad were both there to see us run. Dad was unsure about me competing. It wasn't that he didn't want me to run, quite the opposite. He was just concerned about me being made into a spectacle, but Mom was insistent. "I know Robert can't win," she told Dad at the time, "but he can get in there and try." She didn't want to tell me that I wouldn't be able to keep up and had no chance of winning. She was worried that I'd sit on my backside and give up, and that I'd stop trying. Race day came and I got all dressed up and ready to run. Mom had bought me a new white sports t-shirt, green shorts, one sneaker, and one long white sock. The shoe and sock would go on my right leg, which had an actual artificial foot. My left foot was still just a horse's hoof of solid metal. We sat on the dusty hill next to Iona's main oval and watched as small, uncoordinated kids ran race after race. Mixed among them were a few athletes who stood out with their speed and grace. Then it was my turn, and I lined up with the other kids. Mom and Dad stood on the sidelines. "I still don't like it," Dad said. "Well, Vince," Mom said, "if you feel like walking over there and taking him out of the race, you can, but I'm not about to." It was too late anyway. I was on the starting line, skinny kids on either side of me with big eyes, bad haircuts, and white t-shirts of their own, and happy to give it a go. I bent down and leaned forward, pushing my arms out in front of me like I was going to somehow box my way into the race. I wasn't thinking about running a record time or qualifying for the Olympics or being a spectacle. I just wanted to run and win. "On your marks," the starter shouted. "Get ready!" Bang! For at least 4 strides, I kept up with the other kids. I was taking what seemed like giant steps with my right leg. I had no working left knee, real or artificial, and most of the leg consisted of just 2 pieces of straight metal. As I ran, I had to swing that leg in a semicircle away from my body. Normally, I was fairly disciplined about keeping it close to my body to try to disguise my limp. It was still obvious that it wasn't a real leg, but I did my best. All of that went out the window as soon as I started to run. I swung my left leg wildly to my side, almost knocking over a kid in the next lane. About 30 feet into the race, I was already way behind the others, but I just kept powering on. I could still catch them. When I realized I was probably going to be last, I started swinging my arms faster. That's what they did on television, and tried to pump my legs faster. That only made me swing my left leg wider and wilder. About a third of the way into the race, I was going so fast for me that I started to trip. I felt myself tumbling forward and tried to stop, but it was no use. Down I went. I fell forward, which I was used to. The grass on the oval of Iona was soft, and I wasn't really hurt. I picked myself up and saw the other kids were well over halfway done, but not yet finished. Still time to catch them, I thought. I powered arms and legs swinging, puffing away. By the time I reached the halfway point, the other kids were crossing the finish line. Now I was racing myself, really, racing on my own, but not alone. Parents and teachers nearby started cheering me on, and I finished the race feeling like a winner. The timekeeper at the finish line later said he had to ask the other kids in the race who'd won because everyone was watching me instead. Mom asked me if I minded not winning. No, of course not, I said. Later, Catherine ran her race and managed to come in last as well. I turned to Mom and said, "Look, Catherine came in further last than I did." Falling over and finishing last in a running race and bashing my way out of buildings after space stations crashed on them were all well and good. But eventually I realized I could use my disability to make people laugh. One afternoon, Mom came to pick me up from school early for an appointment. She came to our classroom, but my teacher, Sister Marie Patrice, was off talking to another teacher in a different room. Everyone in the class had their heads down, but someone saw Mom waiting at the door. The kids started shouting out, "Hello, Mrs. Hogue!" And I jumped up. I got into the habit of loosening the long laces that held the leather socket tight to my left stump when I sat down. As I stood up, my artificial legs started to rattle loose. It was a shock at first, but then I started shaking my left stump wildly until my artificial leg fell off entirely. I was holding myself up with my hands on nearby desks and hopping on one leg. "Hi, Mom!" I shouted. David jumped up and started hopping around too, almost tripping on my leg, which was now on the floor. Others were about to join in when Mom saw Sister Marie Patrice walking back. "Quick, hurry, sister," she called out. Rotted out by my own mother. I sat down and quickly grabbed my leg from the floor as the fearsome nun stood at the door next to my mother and gave us a strange look. "Robert and David, come here, please," she said. I'd only half finished putting my leg on and hadn't tightened up the laces, but I was so frightened I started walking to the door. David got to the teacher first, and she gave him a whack on the bottom. "In the future, behave," she said. "Yes, sister," David said, and went and sat back down at his desk. Then it was my turn. She gave me a harmless whack on the bum, but for some reason I overbalanced and fell forward. My left leg, still not properly secured, fell off. It toppled in one direction, and I toppled in the other. Sister Marie Patrice just got redder and redder. She was probably the maddest I'd ever seen her. A hush came over the whole class. A few kids at the back stood up so they could see. They burst out laughing until they got one of Sister Marie Patrice's looks. "Put that leg on," she said, "and get up." Then she turned to my mom, looking horrified. "This has never happened in my classroom before," she said. Mom, who had done a very good job of keeping her composure for the whole time, finally burst out laughing. I was starting to realize that while kids laughing at you could be very hurtful, kids laughing at something you'd done was a different thing entirely. That wasn't the only time I caused grief for poor Sister Marie Patrice. Because our school was so close to the water, we'd regularly walk the block down to the shore for a quick excursion. Sometimes it was to look at the islands dappled on the horizon, other times to talk about the jetty and how boats might have used it in days gone by. I'm sure it was occasionally just an excuse to get us kids out of the classroom and have us run around on the grass. Moreton Bay is bordered on the north by Red Cliff and on the south by Wellington Point, with Wynnum in the middle. It's protected by Moreton Island and North Stradbroke Island, which means calm waters and no surf. When the tide went out, it went out almost 300 feet, about 3/4 of a way along the jetty at Wynnum. It left behind a vast expanse of mud, seaweed, shells, and occasionally very unlucky jellyfish. One day, Sister Marie Patrice took the class down to the foreshore. The tide was out, and soon enough of us had scattered and found our way onto the mud flats. The other kids took their shoes off before they squelched around in the mud, but I figured with my artificial legs, everything would be just fine. Unfortunately, I got a bit too adventurous. After stepping out from the shore, I saw some interesting rocks that I wanted to investigate. This was a wet, smelly mistake. I ventured farther from the shore, but my left leg sank deep into the mud, well beyond where my ankle would have been. Any normal kid would have used his or her knee to pull the leg up and out of the mud, but I have no left knee. Instead, I started working my leg back and forth, trying to create enough room to swing it out. That didn't work, it just made the leg sink further. As I tried to work my left leg free, I put all my weight on my right leg until it started to sink as well. I flailed my arms about, consumed by images of quicksand from old Tarzan movies and episodes of Gilligan's Island. I looked for a vine I could grab onto, but there was none nearby. I paused for a moment to think and noticed that I stopped sinking when I didn't move. I figured I could just stand there for a while and see what happened, though the tide would come in eventually, I supposed. The other kids were doing their own thing, oblivious to me. I decided I'd give it one more go. A big effort. Surely that would work. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, trying as hard as I could to drag my left leg up and out of the mud. For a second, it felt like it was working, but then I lurched too far. I was used to falling over, well practiced at it, in fact. I'd feel myself falling, shove my hands forward, and lock my elbows and shoulders as tightly as I could and fall. Better to end up with sore palms than to face plant. But it was not the right strategy this time. I shoved my hands out in front of me, locked my elbows and shoulders, and slowly toppled over. I was expecting the usual jarring thud, but my hands didn't stop when they hit the mud. Instead, they kept going into the slimy mire, past my wrists, past my forearms, stopping just as the mud reached my elbows. I now had all 4 limbs stuck in the mud. I let out a slight squeal of panic. Behind me, I heard a loud gasp. Sister Marie Patrice must have spotted me. There was no mistaking the sound of a nun who was equal parts concerned, annoyed, and frustrated that she'd have to wade into the mud herself to save one of her more stupid students. Suddenly, the mud didn't seem so bad. By then, the other kids had seen me as well, and those who disobeyed the instructions not to go out too far started making their way back to safety. Sister Marie Patrice lifted up the long skirt of her habit, and for the first time in my life, I saw her ankles. Quickly, those lily-white ankles became covered in mud. As she got close, I thought I was going to cop a whack on the bum, but when she reached me, Sister Marie Patrice just grabbed my arms and tried to pull me out. No luck. Then she grabbed my left leg and, with what I assumed was Jesus-powered strength, slowly dragged it up out of the mud. Then she kind of lifted me up and over. My hands came out first, then my right leg with a vacuum plop as the mud rushed to fill the newly vacated space. It took us a while, and I was really tired from all that exertion, but eventually we made our way back to solid ground. I had mud on my shoe, on my sock, on my artificial legs, inside my artificial legs, on my gray shorts, on my shirt, under my fingernails, and halfway up my arms. Now, Robert, don't you go back out there, understand? I nodded. Yes, sister. I sat on the retaining wall and watched her walk away. She looked back at me a few times, but I just stared innocently out at St. Helena Island, thinking about the people who'd been so bad that they had to be sent away from a penal colony to a special prison on an island all its own. Finally, she was far enough away, paying attention to other kids. I could have a bit of a look around, I thought. It would be okay if I didn't go too far. I ventured back out onto the mud flats and got stuck again.